Regina, you describe yourself as an engineer, artist, a taskmaster, and product developer. And Fortune magazine described you as one of the world's leading experts on product innovation. With an exceptional career as the first serving director of DARPA as a woman, you led teams to deliver breakthrough innovation. Now you're serving the CEO of Welcome Leap. Can you tell us about your journey and what you brought you to focus on global health?
Yeah, Young, it's so interesting because in many ways, I feel like I've been training for this role for my whole life. And here's the backstory that many people don't know. When I was 9 years old, I was diagnosed with catastrophic ovarian cancer. It was summer of 72. The doctors told my parents they didn't expect me to live to Christmas. They said I had about a 10% shot at survival. And I went through 2.5 years of chemo, three major surgeries, and spoiler alert, here I am. I made it. Of course, I went on to finish my PhD. I served a tour at DARPA as a program manager, went back to the private sector, and then became the director of DARPA. And after that, the roles in Silicon Valley, where you and I originally first met. And now, here, this role as the CEO of Welcome Leap comes to me. And, and I felt like it was my opportunity to give back to the people and the field that had made my entire life possible, quite literally. So I simply had to say yes.
That's really awesome. I mean, I remember the story we talked about and your own personal experience, and nothing more personal than you going through difficult health challenges. And imagine surviving that and being able to drive and being able to successfully then be able to contribute. And I can just see the full circle here. I understand that Welcome Leap Fund is a $250 million charity designed to accelerate discovery and innovation for the benefit of health by taking risk and providing a funding at scale. So I'm just curious about which area of focus that you are looking at to innovate.
Well, here again, we should look at the origins of Welcome Leap. So in 2018, the Wellcome Trust, in moments of, I think, important self-reflection, asked from their unique place in the world, could they do more? Could they have more impact? Was there an innovation gap in human health advances that needed to be filled? And so after study, they looked at large organizations that have a good history of innovation. They looked in the venture community. They also looked at DARPA as a model. And what they said is, indeed, there is an innovation gap here. We need to have programs that are bold, that have a high risk tolerance, and programs that reach across many boundaries. And what I mean by that is the boundaries of disciplines, the boundaries of organizations. So in our programs, we very often have research and academic organizations, as well as startups and large companies, all participating towards a goal. And the idea here is to do that project-oriented work. It's very characteristic of the type of work we did at DARPA, and that led to a 60-year track record of real breakthroughs in innovation. So that's our intent, to do the kind of work that teams can do together and couldn't do individually, couldn't do alone. So if you look at a program like HOPE, so that's the Human Organs Physiology and Engineering program, as you described, it has two particular goals. The first is to double the preclinical predictive value of a screen so that we can reduce the risk in development. And particularly here, we're looking at multi-organ systems that have immune competency, which is a high failure rate type of therapeutic or intervention, and make progress there. And that would affect not only infectious disease, but also autoimmune diseases and cancer. And the second goal for HOPE is to double the 5-year survival rate for someone who's in end-stage kidney failure or who's on replacement therapy, with the idea that within 10 years, we could cultivate a full human organ that could be a replacement for a failing organ in a human. So it's a bold ambition, as you can see, and we're excited about it.
Now let's talk a little bit about vaccines. So it is remarkable how fast the vaccine has been developed. And it is, in a way, it's our moment of really test our agility, our collaboration, our innovation. All those things come together in just what, less than a year. I want to just get your perspective because I know you are involved in early on with companies like Moderna. You are involved in development of mRNA technology, which is really a critical part of technology that can enable us to create a vaccine without having pathogen protein that are being introduced to our body, which to me is the big change that are happening, and being able to go through the breakthrough regulatory shifts and being able to test them in a record way so that we can be able to deploy the vaccines. So I'd like to get your perspective on this.
Sure. Well, look, I think one of the things that's true is that in this pandemic, we've laid bare how much work there is to do in health across policy, equity, speed and scale, as you said. But we can also be very grateful for the difference that a breakthrough makes. And the breakthrough we're talking about here is mRNA vaccines. So let's level set. So the normal time to develop a vaccine is 3 to 10 years. 3 to 10 years, that's the normal time to develop a vaccine to a novel pathogen. We went from virus sequence to first dosing in humans, in the case of the Moderna vaccine, in 63 days. 63 days. It's frankly a stunning scientific achievement. And I think it will one day be known as one of the most important scientific advances of our generation. So you mentioned that we had some involvement at DARPA, and this is true. So this started about a decade ago when at DARPA we made some of the pivotal investments in mRNA vaccine development. And this is how it came about. It's a good study of what it means when you take on these bold, risk-tolerant projects where you're asking, what if it's successful? So let me paint the scene for you. So imagine this nondescript government building, a conference room lined with whiteboards and some of the brightest scientific and engineering minds in the country inside this conference room. And a particular program manager, his name is Dan Wattendorf, who I think is one of the unsung heroes in this story. He's pitching a DARPA program as we would do. We were evaluating new program starts. And so Dan stands at the front of the room and he asks two important what if questions. What if we have a global pandemic and it's a novel pathogen, something we haven't seen before, and the world is shut down and we can't wait years for a vaccine? That was the first what if question. The second what if question was, what if we could use mRNA to encode the protein and have the body produce that protein, generate an immune system response, and get a much faster vaccine candidate? Now, what you have to understand is that at that point, DNA vaccines had been tried and they produced protein, they just lacked potency. And Dan's key insight was that maybe mRNA could do two things: encode the protein and tickle the immune system enough to ramp up production. And there were a lot of critics, and the critics said, there's no evidence that this will work. And Dan said, there's no evidence that it won't work. And if it does, someday it will matter. Well, that day has come. And that's the history of it. That's the kind of what if bold program that needs to happen. We need more of those kind of breakthroughs. And that's exactly why we formed Wellcome Leap.
That is incredible. And this is some years ago, right? When you were in DARPA.
It was a decade ago. Frankly, it was the most important day of my time at DARPA. I just didn't know it at the time. I think this will become one of the top 5 contributions that DARPA has made over time, right alongside the internet and GPS. It was just a remarkable achievement.
That is incredible. You know, Regina, I just realized the audience are very global, worldwide. Maybe it'll be good to also give an introduction to the audience about the job you had at DARPA. how important it is and what came out of it that has been essential part of our life.
Yeah. So DARPA is probably the best little government agency that nobody's ever heard of, to your point. You know, even many Americans don't know about DARPA. The history of the organization of the agency goes all the way back to 58. 57 was when Sputnik launched. Remember that. So October 4th, 1957, Sputnik launches as a satellite. The US is caught unaware, strategic surprise, and the nation goes into full mobilization. And what they say is, how did this happen? And many things then start to occur. So in 1958, DARPA is formed as part of our response to that strategic surprise. The question is, how do we keep this from ever happening again? And the agency was formed with a very explicit never again strategy that we would both prevent and create strategic surprise so that we were never caught unaware again. And so now in the 60 plus intervening years, DARPA has been responsible for the miniaturization of GPS, the ARPANET, which is now the internet, the origins of microelectromechanical systems, the little sensors that are prolific now that we have in our cell phones and many other devices in our airbags in our cars, but also the early investments in microelectronics, lasers, night vision, stealth technology. It's a remarkable track record, probably the single longest standing track record of breakthrough innovation in the world.
When we had a conversation earlier, I remember about a year or 2 years ago, you mentioned about how you select DARPA program. So it's not just that you support any program, but there is a very clear selection program, there is a clear filters, and there's a clear management. And you don't do everything in this agency, right? You farm that out to universities, labs. So if you can be able to help us say, how do you select the great programs and how do you manage them with the government agency, which, as you know, typically known as bureaucracy, slow and expensive.
So DARPA is an example of an organization that can move very quickly. So DARPA administers about a $3.5 billion a year budget with about just over 200 people full-time. We set a very clear goal, and we understand that we must advance something in the science and engineering in order to meet that goal. We measure it all along the way, and then we time box the project, and we have many participate who can contribute to the best of their ability from wherever they are in their organizations. So here's the most important filter that we go through, and that is every project must sit in what we call Pasteur's Quadrant. Pasteur's Quadrant is the name for use-inspired research, and it is characterized exactly as we have described in this conversation: a very clear goal or a problem you're trying to solve, and the need to advance the science and the engineering in order to solve it. It was named after Pasteur because we had a clear problem, a food safety issue, people were dying, but we couldn't solve it until we understood it was the microorganisms in the food, and that if we raise the temperature, we could kill them. Pasteurization was the result. Now, this isn't the only style of work that is done. We also have basic science that happens in other organizations, let's say in the case of health at NIH, which is more curiosity driven at the individual researcher level. And then we have scaling and impact that happens in commercial entities. But this Pasteur's Quadrant work, this breakthrough innovation work, is often the innovation gap that is missing in companies and also in other organizations. It's really important.
Great. Now, going back to our discussion from DARPA to now your own programs, and I understand that you announced that 1,000 days, the first 1,000 days are so critical in our health, and there is a big program around this, and I didn't realize how much of our brain and all that is shaped in that first 1,000 days. So could you tell us about the first 1,000-day programs?
Yeah. So this is the second program we've launched from Wellcome Leap, and we're very excited about the potential impact here. You're exactly correct, Jan, in saying that these first 1,000 days are critical. And if you think about it, what we often use is a tape measure and a scale to measure whether a child is developing properly physically. And we have norms to measure that against and so on. And yet, in this first 1,000 days, the amount of brain development is enormous. And by age 3, an individual's executive function, their cognitive development capacity at that point, very much determines their ability to effectively deal with obstacles and opportunities later in life. And so many things happen in this period. We have circuit formation, we have circuit pruning, we have it over different phases and parts of your development, sensory motor development. We also have emotional control developing, we have language developing. There are waves of critical development in these first 1,000 days. And what's so interesting about this now is that our sense is that the advances in biology, the cell biology, our advances in our understanding of how nutrition affects circuit formation, and then importantly, how interactions with the environment can be assessed and measured and understood so that we can model this critical period and then optimize and develop the appropriate tools to promote brain development in this period. It's actually hugely important, and we need to get it. We need to get it right. We need to have more insight there.
It's really interesting to see how important it is to having that early care, early support, and having the right nutrition for all those development. And in some ways, it can really shape your long-term success and failure.
That's right. Well, this is, I think, an area where we see how important it is to cross disciplines and organizations. And here's what I mean. We need, for example, your community to be participating in this program. And the reason is we need better sensors, we need better data collection, we need better modeling to understand how the circuit pruning happens through the interaction with the environment. How does turn taking on the part of the caregiver with the infant affect their language development? How does a child's interaction with the environment affect their sensory motor development? And so we want startups and large companies to participate and contribute, in addition to the biologists that are working in research communities, to help us figure out how to model these systems and develop the appropriate promotion strategies so that we give so many kids the right start in life.
Gathering more insights through the data that could be coming from sensors, and then being able to aggregate them, and then being able to analyze what that means. It is an interesting, the voice of the body journey, isn't it? So that we know better about our body and better understanding about what that means.
Exactly. We're very excited about it. So, here we go. Bold program, risk tolerant, funded at scale. Here we go.
So I want to talk a little bit about data and AI, because I'm sure you also done a lot of work on this. And as you know, the large natural language computer models are real now. And when you talk to Hey Google or Siri, others, it understands most of what we are saying, in some ways actually better than maybe humans. So the models that can be able to learn to now write and speak, it has really taken a big step forward, particularly with GPT-3, by far the largest and most literate to date. It does give you what it can be. It requires a lot of data. It requires a lot of compute power. But still, by training on the text of thousands of books that are out there in the internet, it can be able to mimic what human can write, and being able to even do the things that are really uncanny, which is scary in some ways because it's so rare. As impressive as they are, in some ways, it is trained by text from the internet, which is filled with misinformation and prejudice. And so my question to you is two questions. Given this advancement that we have seen, what do you see AI going forward, and how do you make sure that this bias is managed better in some ways, so that we can be able to believe what is real and what's not?
Well, you and I have had a conversation previously about ethics and how we think about the development of technology in the context of the world we want to live in. And I think AI is a perfect example of work that still needs to be done. So the particular approach that I feel very strongly about and that we need here is something called an ethics, legal, and societal implications activity. So so-called ELSI work. And I feel we are behind in doing good ELSI work for artificial intelligence. And let me tell you a little bit about a case where I felt it was done very effectively. So in the early days of the Human Genome Project, we had very much the same kind of conversation that we're having now about AI. Could it lead to apocalyptic outcomes? Could it cure all diseases? We saw conversations that were on both sides of that extreme. Now, of course, the truth was somewhere much more in the middle, but that was in no small part due to very good ELSI work that was done in the early days of the Human Genome Project. And so what that work focused on was answering the kinds of questions that give us guardrails so that the technology emerges into the kind of world we want to actually live in. So here's an example. Let's say someone you know has a genetic predisposition to Parkinson's disease. It should be their decision whether they want to know that or not. But it should also be true that if they have a genetic predisposition, they can't be denied a job, they can't be denied insurance. And the ELSI work is what creates those kinds of guardrails so that the societal implications are understood and they begin to have a framing so that the technology emerges into a world that we as humans and social creatures want to live in. And I think we need to do the same kind of work for artificial intelligence.
Let's go to another topic, which I think is my last subject, which is about the leadership and advice that you have. You were the 19th DARPA director, which is equivalent to what I understand is a 3-star general. So very, impressive, strong leadership position as a woman. And I want to just make sure that, and also you've been involved with the Motorola, Google, Facebook, and others. So I want to just get your perspective around how do you generate more leaders, more diversity at work in a tech community in particular?
Well, let's take that in two parts. So let's talk about the diversity piece first. I have a very specific point of view as it relates to diversity. And I'll start with the numbers for women in tech, which are the ones I know the best. So the dropout rate for women in tech about 5 years after their degree and they've entered the workforce is 41%. It's a very large number. Now, my sense is that we need to approach those kinds of problems that we consider to be strategic. Diversity and inclusion is a strategic issue for companies with the same kind of business sensibility that we would approach any other strategic issue. So let's take that number, 41% dropout, and let's move it into another area that a company might face, manufacturing. Let's imagine you had a particular step in a manufacturing process for a product and it had a 41% dropout. There's no chance that the response in the company would be that we should have a networking lunch. There's no chance that that happens. What would happen is someone would hit the big red button. We'd have a team that's designed to address the problem. We would have metrics and measurable strategies. We would track our progress. We would incent solution to the problem, and we would get it fixed. Now, I can be sure that if we had a 41% dropout in a step of the manufacturing process, we also would not solve that problem by adding more raw material to the front of the pipe. That's not how we would solve that problem. So my concern here is that many times the response in organizations is that we should solve a part of the problem that we don't have direct control over. And while I'm appreciative of organizations trying to help improve the pipeline, what we really need is for organizations to fix the part of the problem that is directly inside their control and to do it with the same kind of business objectives that they would any other strategic issue. Otherwise, what we're essentially saying to women and underrepresented groups is that we're willing to treat you as scrap metal, and I'm just not okay with that. So I think we need to get serious about those kinds of diversity and inclusion objectives, but we need to test whether we're using the kind of business strategies we would use for anything else. So I feel strongly about that, and we know it will work if we take those kinds of strategies. There are good examples of it working.
Clearly, 41% of any dropout in an organization is not acceptable. So you have to, that's a really interesting perspective of looking at it. Rather than outcome of how do you do it better, you have to look at your own data and how do you do it better so that you can be able to look at that as a talent, and talent we want to preserve, talents that you want to educate, and making sure they're all successful.
Yes. Well, I think the analogy, when you start to think of it against other business objectives you would have and test whether you're using comparable strategies, then I think you can start to get some real weight on the issues. And these are leader responsibilities, they have to be. So that brings us to the second part of your question, which is really about leadership. And you know, I mean, people talk about having leadership playbooks and so on. I'm not sure I have a leadership playbook, so to speak, but it's interesting that our conversation comes almost full circle, because the way I think about it is actually formed by that early experience with cancer. And there are 3 basic lessons I learned from that. And I have to say, I couldn't articulate those when I was 9. It took me many years to actually be able to have the words to describe what I think I learned from my early experience with cancer. But I learned 3 things in particular. The first is that the odds don't matter. You'll remember I had about a 10% shot at survival. In that particular case, what matters is the outcome. If the outcome you're seeking is important, in the case of my early experience with cancer, it was basic survival, but in many other cases, there are other objectives that are important. And if you can see a pathway, if you can see that you might be able to solve it, you take the shot. That's important. The second thing that I learned is that if the odds aren't important, if the odds don't matter, every moment really does. So you should live life big, because nobody is promised tomorrow. And then the third I learned from my parents, it's always the most emotional for me to talk about. And that is, if you want to make a difference in someone's life, showing up is key. And here's how my parents taught me that. When I was young and in the hospital, all those days, all those months, whenever I fell asleep at night, my father was sitting at my bedside. And when I woke up in the morning, my mother was sitting there. They would switch in the middle of the night. They just showed up. They didn't always know what to say. They didn't always know what to do, but they were always there. And those 3 principles have shaped my work. They've shaped my personal life. That's just how I think about the world. And it's made a difference to me. And I think the teams and the work that we've done are reflected in those 3 learnings.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate this discussion. I'm sure our audience will benefit from hearing your personal story as well.
Thank you, Young. It's great to see you.